So if we were going to invest 2 billion into distributed renewable energy systems for ordinary people, which would bring their bills down considerably, that would be one thing. So why are we investing it in cars? Well, ostensibly we're investing it because there are a certain number of jobs associated with Jaguar, and there are other reasons too to do with investments that people have. But those jobs could easily be replaced by green transformation jobs, except we've chosen not to do that. So we haven't actually embarked on that journey of creating the new green jobs of the future because we're busy trying to save the jobs of the 20th century. And this, of course, is what I mean by future-proofing. You can't have a government who can't see beyond the end of its own nose.
In this ClimateGenn episode, I'm speaking with Professor Dame Henrietta Moore and Arthur Kay about their new book, Roadkill, Unveiling the True Cost of Our Toxic Relationship with Cars. Despite the motorcars' association with freedom, it has become responsible for the degeneration of our town and city centres, enormous fossil fuel consumption, lung damage from air pollution, and a whole host of undesirable impacts. This book, Roadkill, is not just about diagnosing our car blindness and the true costs of maintaining our addiction to them. It is also about rethinking the future, including urban design and local thinking. Henrietta and Arthur give us insights into how they are tackling this uber-toxic issue, and links to the book and their website are in the notes. In the next episode, we are speaking with Dr. René van Westen about how he and colleagues have created an Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, or AMOC, tipping point warning system, and what this is telling us right now. A preview of this episode will go live in the members area over the weekend. And there are many more episodes being edited at the moment, so thank you very much for listening. Please comment, share, or become a member to support this channel. It's much appreciated. Henrietta and Arthur, thank you very much for joining me today to discuss your book, Roadkill. And it's a fascinating topic because it's so entwined with culture, aspirations, economics, and politics, and so on. If we start at the beginning, despite us knowing that cars are toxic, we know they're polluting, we know they're clogging up our cities, the aspiration to own, to upgrade, is still super strong. Can you talk us through some of the key findings in Roadkill that counter this sort of mythology of the motor car?
I think the mythology is alive and well because people still strongly connect their car with freedom and with choice and with agency and with the ability to just get up and go and do whatever you like. And I think that's one of the car's great advantages, is that it speaks to that part of us that just wants to be able to do whatever we want, whenever we want to do it. And I think that pull is a very difficult thing for us all to resist. And both Arthur and I are drivers, and we're both quite fond of cars. So we're not trying to say to other people, you can't be fond of your car. But what we are saying is that perhaps there's a bit of a chimera here, that the car seems like a freedom. And it might be the freedom of the 20th century, but it certainly isn't the freedom of the 21st century.
And what we try and show in the book in terms of some of those areas that you say everyone kind of knows about this toxic relationship. And I think when it comes to some of the environmental matters, that is true. I think people have been kind of sold or believe this idea that the big issue with the car is that it's a pollutant from an oil and gas perspective. So the fossil fuels that we burn to power our cars is the issue. What we're really arguing for in Roadkill is actually that's one small part of the problem. And we actually start the book from, as Henrietta says, this perspective of the big issue is it's constraining our freedoms. And then we move on to say it's actually really bad for your wallet, and not just in a kind of like general nebulous sense, but actually we go through in granular detail in terms of the cost of a car, both in terms of the upfront cost, but critically over the course of a lifetime. And we argue that this is the most expensive decision that you will make. And then we go on to talk about your cost in terms of your time, literally just the hours stuck in congestion, and then things like the space it takes up in the city. I mean, I'm here calling in from New York City, and across America, we were shocked to discover that there's more parking spaces for cars than there is housing space for people. So when we say that we've designed our cities around cars, we mean it in a very literal sense, that these are literally built into our infrastructure and dictate how we live. And all we're really arguing for in the book is from a city perspective, for the 1 billion cars that are registered to and based in cities, can we think of a way to invite the car in on our terms rather than assume that it can go everywhere all the time just because it can? And that's really, I guess, what the essence of the book is about. It's about that, building a positive relationship with the car rather than a toxic one.
We're now talking about moving very consciously towards electric vehicles. The whole dream moves on with us. How do you approach that? Because obviously a lot of climate people are aspiring towards EVs, and the whole dream moves on. What's your take on that? How does Roadkill analyze that side of it?
Well, part of it is that it is what we call the effect of the car industrial complex. So the car does move on with us. I mean, the car is probably the most successful consumer product ever made. And what marks it out as a success is that it keeps evolving with us. And so the electric car is just the next stage in that process. And when we think about our cities and what's happening to them, of course, an electric car is in many senses better than a one powered by fossil fuels, but there are also all sorts of problems with it. So the first problem is that we have too many cars already on our roads. We don't have any space. And we have too many 5-lane, 10-lane highways all over the world, which are made out of concrete, which are also causing climate problems. We don't really want to build any more of those. And in this sense, if we went on doubling the numbers of cars that we have in the way that we have since they were first invented, none of us would be able to move anywhere. We'd all be stuck. So it wouldn't matter whether they were green. We'd have just produced them, but our cities would be absolutely unlivable. We'd be in a completely fixed point. I mean, a car is already stationary 90% of the time. And even when you think you're moving, whilst you might imagine yourself to be in some kind of 1970s or 1960s American road movie, you're actually mostly in a traffic jam next to some town that you've never heard of and probably hope that you will never have to visit in any particular way. And I think that's one of the issues, is that the car is not our future, regardless of whether it's green or not.
And to build on that, the other elements of the book that we talk about in terms of spatial dimension, in terms of the economics of it, are all still locked in. I mean, Henrietta and I have just written an op-ed arguing that has Trump by accident gone green because from the 30th of September has chosen to abolish the electric car subsidy in the United States. And I think to a lot of listeners that might sound, that's not going green. Electric cars are quote unquote good for the environment and therefore a good thing. And from a carbon perspective, they do pay back within about 10 to 20,000 miles of driving for the environment. But in terms of air quality emissions, the reductions are only about 30 to 40%. So 60 to 70% of those emissions remain, mainly from driving kicks up dust and new particles produced by tyres and wearing brake pads and all sorts of other things, which I don't think is really sold in the narrative. So the zero tailpipe emission marketing element is actually not zero emissions from the vehicle. And I think most listeners, myself included, I'm most interested about what are the emissions caused by a car that I may breathe in, not which part of the car it happens to be coming out of. But there's also a really interesting study that's just been published from some academics in Norway. And Norway's achieved what most governments in the global north aspire to, that 94% of all car sales last quarter were electric. So this sounds like an amazing good news story. And the Norwegian government from 2007 to today has subsidised this transition by about £65 billion. But the big surprising factor that these academics found, that actually that transition has resulted in people driving more in their electric cars than they would do in a conventional car. So between 10 to 20% more, they found, in terms of trips taken and mileage. So it's one of these really counterintuitive things about let's be really careful what we wish for, because you may end up with 94% sales in terms of electric cars. You may end up paying a lot of money to subsidise those drivers, and they're going to end up driving more, not less. And so exactly as Henry says, we're talking about the gross tonnage of car in the world and looking at ways that we can reduce that and introduce a positive option for people to be able to choose from rather than be locked into the car-dependent model.
And it's interesting, this idea of the emissions don't really go away. They're sort of, and then when you start driving more because you think you've got a cleaner method of transport, you're actually just filling the gap anyway. And Trump, with his legislation, is doing something by accident. He's not meaning to help the environment. In terms of policymakers who might be looking at all of this and actually want to do something that's positive, how do they navigate it? And how do they look at things like the rolling contracts that maintain the infrastructure? There's all those jobs baked into all of that, the lobbyists, the whole shebang. How does a policymaker in the Western world, for example, look at that and say, right, I'm going to now start making changes? How does that work?
I think the first thing is that we know we need to make changes. In fact, we don't just need to make change, we actually have to undergo processes of transformation. And those processes of transformation are going to be contested. And the trouble is that many politicians don't want to deal with the contestation, so they hope somehow that by fiddling at the edges, they'll be able to address those problems. But I think the bigger issue is, what role does the car play in our lives? And so one of the things I would suggest is that we do need to make big changes in infrastructure. We need to stop covering the world's surface with cement, for example. We need to move to new technologies. We need to be quite precise about the kind of technologies that are going to take us into a new infrastructural future, where we have different kinds of infrastructures, different kinds of solutions to the problems that we have. So if we started, for example, with the idea that better mobility means a better city and a better life, that would help. At the moment, what we're doing is we're trying to keep the car going because the car industrial complex is deeply involved in political decision-making and political lobbying, so that nearly all senior politicians across the world are somehow involved in its success. It's being sold to the global south as the solution to their economic problems. So if, for example, a big producer like China takes a share of the electric market, we have to realize that part of its vehicles, not all of them, but part of them will be produced somewhere in North Africa, almost certainly, and in other parts of the world as well. So it's the case that the car industrial complex hasn't really made money by making cars per se for a very long time. It's made money mostly by financing those cars and by getting involved in receiving government subsidy for various kinds of R&D explorations. But my view on this would be, if we were serious about it, we would have to get politicians to take the view that the car is not the future, because it's not future-proof. So if we keep producing the car in the way that we are, even if it's a green car, we're going to have unlivable cities. We're going to have infrastructural problems which we can't solve. And there are all kinds of socially toxic things that go alongside that as well, which we can talk about in a minute. But the main thing is that politicians need to come behind the fact that we need a different kind of mobility for the middle part of the 21st century.
And if we look at that from a UK perspective in terms of just the last 6 weeks, we've seen Minister Alexander, the Minister for Transport in the UK government, announcing a new £650 million subsidy for purchasing new electric cars. We've seen the bosses of various big electric car manufacturers, including electric car manufacturers, explicitly saying to the BBC, unless the government gives us this, then we are walking, or we're not going to be doing business with them anymore, which is as close to a kind of mafia boss as you can get in terms of a kind of extortionate behaviour. And then, as of last night, the government bailing out Jaguar Land Rover, who have had a huge cyber breach to the tune of £2 billion in terms of from the standing start saying, OK, bad luck for having a cyber breach, but we're going to underwrite using our sovereign guarantee, UK Export Finance, to be able to say we're going to underwrite any losses that you and your suppliers incur to be up to the tune of £2 billion for this. So this isn't there's this kind of thing out there called the car industrial complex and we need to all be scared of it. It's saying this is stuff that's happening day in, day out. And one of the reasons we were so eager to write this book and to shine a light on some of this stuff was, when you see it, you can't unsee it. We call it car blindness, and it's something that I certainly had. I can't speak to Henrietta, but I certainly had everything from when you walk down a street and you see a row of cars either side of that street for as long as you can see, and you think, oh, that's just what a street looks like. Actually, that's not what a street looks like. A street was originally there for a whole bunch of reasons, which may or may not include some elements of some cars and a range of other stuff, but it wasn't always dominated in spatially by cars. When you look at how our economies are made, again, you kind of see it in there, but when people talk about advanced manufacturing, when people talk about oil, 69% of oil is used in cars, so sold into the automotive sector and used to burn. So we talk about these as different industries. We talk about the shopping centre. This is invented for the car. All these different typologies are tied together and sold and packaged up through this lifestyle of driving. So it's not explicitly car manufacturers, it's the whole network and how government plays into that so critically as well.
But also think about the difficulty people are having at the moment with the cost of living. So if we were going to invest 2 billion into distributed renewable energy systems for ordinary people, which would bring their bills down considerably, that would be one thing. So why are we investing it in cars? Well, ostensibly we're investing it because there are a certain number of jobs associated with Jaguar, and there are other reasons too to do with investments that people have. But those jobs could easily be replaced by green transformation jobs, except we've chosen not to do that. So we haven't actually embarked on that journey of creating the new green jobs of the future because we're busy trying to save the jobs of the 20th century. And this, of course, is what I mean by future-proofing. You can't have a government who can't see beyond the end of its own nose. And you have to have an idea of what you're going to do and when you're going to do it. So you can't just have a general idea that we'll all have green cars. That's not going to bring about the transformation we need, and it's not going to bring about the transformation in the economy. So there's a lot of loose talk around these issues and very little substance. And that's the thing that's extremely worrying given the circumstances that we're all facing.
There's a whole number of things inside what you both just said there that it keep unpicking. But it's almost like that we've got these parasitic zombie industries that are just gluing themselves onto society. And I noticed in your book you have the crib sheet solutions towards the end. And I was going through those and looking at them. And one of them was 15-minute cities. Now, these have been politically weaponized. Something that seems inherently rational and normal has been demonized by groups in the UK as something that is potentially damaging for us. And so our social narrative has become toxic. The industries that benefit from all of this, as you say, we're seeing the collapse of towns because these giant retail parks are being built outside them and no one wants to go into the centres anymore. All of these problems, the motorcar is sort of quietly zooming around in between it. How do we start to unpick that sort of toxic social side? The policymakers, almost like they feel it's necessary to put up money, make a big public splash about saving Jaguar, for example, because we're stuck at the moment. And how do we expand everything that you're talking about into a coherent public narrative?
Well, I think one of the things that we talk about in the book is the way that local residents are often making changes in their own communities and on their own streets and in their own towns and cities already. So people may be quite skeptical about climate change, but something that they're much more aware of is air pollution. And air pollution has huge costs. In the United Kingdom last year, the cost of air pollution to the economy was something like £27 billion. So it's huge. And people know that air pollution is not good for them. They want greener spaces. They don't want to have that problem crossing roads. They want their children to be able to go out of the door without the threat of being run over. So they're already beginning to think about how to reclaim the streets. Now, the difficulty is that when you bring any kind of policy in, social media takes over. And the difficulty with social media is that it amplifies the voices of the minority against the voices of the majority, because the minority who are annoyed are on the social media complaining all the time. The majority who are not annoyed by, say, a traffic calming scheme or 20 miles an hour outside a school or whatever the change is, are not on social media at all because they're quite happy with what's going on. or they might be a little bit uncertain about it, but they're not trying to bring the whole thing down. So we have this problem about how do we bring people who live in communities together with those who have to make the decisions. And so we've looked at lots of examples in the book Roadkill about how local communities come together with civil society organizations, with local authorities and with national authorities, or perhaps city authorities, to drive change where change is needed. And that's what's successful, bringing people into the conversation about what the future of their lives will look like.
In our crib sheet of solutions, we have around 150 different approaches. And one of the big challenges, both in writing the book and to an extent in talking about the book, is because the way we call it a many-headed hydra. So the way that the car industrial complex has knitted into our society, unpicking that, there's no kind of silver bullet. There's no kind of way of saying, hey, let's just get this done in one go. And so we have around 150 different solutions, and we know there are hundreds more out there that are happening, as Henry says, in communities around the world. But what we've tried to do with this is to try and break them down into some which are quite prosaic, quite simple, things about how you can immediately look at your immediate life in your neighborhood, and then some which are much more meaty and even geopolitical in terms of kind of how we can unpick some of this kind of global network in terms of the car industrial complex. And so we don't have a silver bullet with it, but what we try and do is kind of catalog these different solutions. And we've uploaded this to our website, which is getroadkill.com. And we want to have this as a living document that people can contribute to, challenge, revise, enhance, so we kind of keep this as a document which grows over time as well.
And I think that's why we developed this philosophical framework in the book, which starts with the question, what should I know? And then goes on to ask, what can I hope for? And then goes from there to say, what should I do? Because very often when we have a lot of negative information about something, take climate change as a very good example, most people are overwhelmed by the negativity of that information. There's no obvious pathway for them to take. And not everybody's convinced that just by taking one less holiday a year, we will solve the problem of climate change. In fact, even scientists like me are not convinced by this argument. There are loads of problems with that particular kind of argument. And when people are overwhelmed, what they very often do is to throw up their hands and say, I can't manage. I have no idea what to do. I think I'll just go to a local cafe and have a coffee, or go to a local bar and have a beer, and try not to think about it too much. And so what we do in the book is to say, okay, we can give you some interesting information that we have discovered whilst we've been doing this work. And then we can talk about what other people have been doing. So what can you hope for? What kind of change can you bring about? How can you be involved in change? How can it be part of your life for the future? How could your life be better if these changes were brought in? And then we've moved on to say, let's look at what we might do. How can we do this together? And basically, it's by bringing different kinds of stakeholders together that we get the most purchase. And that's not an easy solution, because very often we have problems in political and social life around things like, for example, shall we build housing in areas that are currently green? So areas that are reserved for green spaces for various reasons. Shall we build housing in those places, even though we know we're very, very short of housing? So some people are saying yes, and some people are saying no. But in a modern democracy of the 21st century, we have to face up to those kinds of contestations, and they have to be worked out at the very local level, so that people who are making those decisions and are discussing them are the people who will be living with their consequences. And one of the things that people find very, very difficult around the whole climate issue and the transformations we need to make is that they can see that there are winners and losers, and they fear that they're going to be losers.
A lot of what you're talking about in terms of the crib sheet and so on, and this kind of reaching into society and reaching into groups at the ground level. I think there's one called Mums for Lungs in London, but there's lots of different groups. It's almost like that they can take this book and start using it to analyze, to think about the local environment and how they can tweak and make changes and improvements. Is that a sort of one of the objectives for this, to help people kind of envision their surroundings better?
Absolutely right. The reason we embarked on writing this book is that we felt, that analogy of people in a blindfolded room touching an elephant, and somebody's touching the tusk and it's smooth and hard, and someone's touching the tail and it's bristly, and someone's stroking the side and it's gnarly. But they're all they take their blindfolds off and they're all touching the same elephant. And we've, to an extent, felt like that about the car industrial complex. When people are talking about cost of living, they forget that, we argue the most expensive decision of their lives is to become a driver, and the second biggest line item on day-to-day after housing is transport, of which the car takes up the biggest segment of it. When people talk about air quality, we use the word air quality, but it's a synonym for pollution from cars. When we talk about, oil and carbon, the biggest single emitter of noise pollution and air pollution is from cars. Social isolation, obviously part of this is social media, but cars play a huge role in that. So a lot of these things, these different elements which would touch around that, but because they've been segmented out into quite specific symptoms, we're forgetting that they come from the same root cause. And we've been trying to technocratically treat the solutions, but without providing that rich underlying philosophical arguments about why one would actually want to make some of these changes. And that's why writing this book with my background as an urban designer, as an entrepreneur, and why writing this with Henrietta, who's a very eminent, excuse your blushes, Henrietta, but kind of anthropologist and philosopher, which is quite an unusual person to write a book, which is typically written by kind of a transport engineer who's talking about, speeds and all this kind of stuff. We're not experts on some of those technocratic solutions at all and don't pretend to be. But what we're trying to do is provide that rich vein and the argument to the people, whether it's Mums for Clean Air or Mums for Lungs, or whether it's an activist in Manila, or whether it's someone trying to do a micro-mobility startup in Brasilia, or whether it's someone looking at dense urban housing and infill in Los Angeles. We're trying to say that actually this is one book, but we think an important one that can link these together and provide that philosophical framework to go out and make some of these arguments and prove it, not on the case of, you should do this because you're a goodie and therefore this is what goodies do, but actually on the argument saying this will expand your freedoms. This will save you money or give you the opportunity to make even more money. This will save you time, which is, as we all know, so valuable. This will improve the quality of life of you and your children and your families and your grandmother or grandfather, whatever it happens to be. So we're trying to put in the perspective of really prosaic day-to-day, but how it can actually make your life better.
One of the things I'd like to say is that we very much enjoyed working on the history of the car, not least because 1897 we had electric taxis in London, we had electric bicycles, we had almost everything we have now. And we've been on a very long detour. And that detour now, I think, has come to an end. And it's time to think again about how we see the future. Now, the car will probably always be part of our future because it's about choice. It's about having a mix of mobility options. But it's also about thinking, can we live better than we do? And when we make that kind of interrogation, we can't come up with a single answer because we are very, very many billions of people. We live on a very diverse planet under very different kinds of historical and cultural and political circumstances. And we want to have our own forms of self-determination there. So what is the good life is something that has to be determined by people in place. And so there isn't a single solution, as Arthur said earlier. But what there are a whole range of options which are out there, which are already in the world. And so we could just pick them up, dust them down, and get a move on.
Thank you very much. It's a really important topic, and I hope the book gets lots of traction. I certainly advise people to get it and read it. So, yeah, thank you very much.
No, thank you very much for having us on the show.
Thank you very much, Nick. Honoured to be here.
If you are concerned about the future, then why not travel with me through every COP conference from COP21 in Paris to COP28 in Dubai by ordering my book, COP Out, How Governments Have Failed the People on Climate. In COP Out, you'll gain insights into what is actually going on in these supposed world-saving conferences and how we have ended up in this dire era of dangerous consequences. You can order COP Out via the link in the notes or on any online bookstore worldwide in paperback or audio version.